A couple of things. Whenever we start a new sefer, I think it's worth spending 2 or 3 minutes just sort of giving ourselves the context of where this sefer takes place and like, where are we? So we know we're in the middle book of the Torah, which is always an exciting thing. We finished last week and we start a new one this week. But what's interesting about this, and Rabbi David Foreman talks about this a lot, if you're familiar with his website or his books, Aleph Beta, brilliant person who just always an interesting approach and things that personally, I think most of us would not have thought of in the way that he looks at text. And one of the things that he points out is that this book, which begins at the end of Sefer Shmot, what we would expect is for there to be some continuity, meaning at the end of Breshit, after the Jewish people come down to Mitzrayim, then we get like a little recap of what happened, how all the Jews came to Egypt, and then the story continues. So we would expect at the end, after last week's Parsha, where the Ananim, the clouds, are over the Mishkan, and the Mishkan is complete, and then there's a cloud that fills the Mishkan itself, that then we would find out that, okay, good, the Jewish people have a Mishkan. Now they're going to start traveling again, because the Torah told us the clouds are part of that process. And so now the Jewish people, we're going to see them moving in the desert. But instead, what happens is the Jewish people don't do anything for an entire book. The whole book of Vayikra, the Jewish people are stationary. And I think that kind of gets lost because most of us are not, I don't want to say we're not fans of Vayikra. We don't know her well. She's the friend that we haven't spent enough time with. So we make a lot of judgments about her because she seems kind of difficult to relate to. So we'll hopefully have an easier time relating to Vayikra as we study it together. But it's essentially, this whole book, as you know, is primarily about karbanos and about other more esoteric types of things that are not as relevant for us today. It's true that there are mitzvos in there like kashrus and other things, the story of Nadav and Avihu. There are stories and there are mitzvos, a lot of mitzvos. But as a rule, the book tends to be like a closed book. We always joke that it's sort of like the middle child. It's the third book of the Torah, and it's like, kind of sandwiched in between the like super exciting stories of the first 2 books and the super exciting stories of the last 2 books. But Midbar in particular is filled, chock full of mitzvos and stories, and it's like fantastic. And so Vayikra just kind of gets like short shrift, and people don't typically relate to it in the same way. I actually had the opportunity to teach it for the first time last year at Hebrew Academy, which was the first time I had really had an opportunity to get into it. And it is a phenomenal sefer, does not deserve the bad reputation that it has. So Sefer Bamidbar, then the Jews start moving. We have all these stories, but what happens in between? So Rabbi Foreman points out that for the entire book of Vayikra, for all, like the whole thing, I can't remember how many parshot it is, they are sitting at Har Sinai. And there's something about that image that I think is very powerful, that here throughout all of Breshit, we know the stories of the family becoming a nation. And then in Shmot, they go through all the miracles of the Pesach story, of course. And then they receive the Torah and they have the sin of the golden calf. And then they get the Mishkan. And at that point, Hashem has basically explained to us, this is the process that a person or a people goes through in order to be able to merit Hashem living amongst them. These are the things you need to do in order to merit to have a Mishkan. And he gives us quite a few mitzvot in Parshat Mishpatim, all the interpersonal things. And then the Mishkan comes and it's like remarkable. Oh my gosh, they finally have Hashem in their midst. Sefer Vayikra is the sefer that tells us where Hashem speaks to us and we are not distracted. We're not moving. We're sitting in our seats. It's like one very long class, one very long period in school, where Hashem is explaining to us, now that you figured out, now that you merited to have me live amongst you, this is how you're going to keep me here. This is the recipe. What's going to be in this book is what's going to allow you to hold on to the Har Sinai experience and keep this very close connection. And I think that's like a nice context in which to look at the whole subject of Karbanot in general, the whole notion of building a relationship with Hashem through something that I think is a little bit difficult for us to relate to. So what we try to focus on are the laws of the Karbanot and why were they what they were, and what is that meant to instill in us, what ideas, what lessons. And that's a very meaningful way to study the book of Vayikra. And again, just to keep in mind that there's sort of like, the book is bookended by all of these narratives and all of these stories. And here we are just sort of basking in the glory of like, we have the Mishkan and now we're sitting and learning Torah with Hashem. And he's telling us like, you guys You're amazing. Look what you did. Now let me explain to you how you and I can keep this close connection. So with that being said, we're not going to talk about so many of the details of the Karbanos today, but I would encourage you to not skip it. In general, I would say we tend to get nervous around the Karbanos, like, oh, do I know the difference between a Chatas and an Ola and an Asham? So after having taught it, and last year was really the first time I sat and studied it at that level, there's really so much practical relevance. Like the meaning is very significant. What are the differences between the Karbanot? What sins do they come to atone for? Why is this part burnt and this part not? The commentaries really did not shy away from it. We might shy away from it, but they did not. And there's really a lot of beauty there. But I want to actually focus on just, I guess, more the relationship piece between us and Hashem and how it all comes out in the first pasuk. So the first pasuk, I apologize, I'm not sharing my screen, but I think you might all be familiar with what I'm about to say, which is that the first pasuk of this week's parsha of Sefer Vayikra is Vayikra Hashem el Moshe, Vayedaber. Vayikra Hashem el Moshe. I should pull it up. Vayedaber something. Lamor, because I know how it ends. I'm going to pull up on my screen so that we can all look at it together. And the famous thing that I think most people are familiar with is that the word Vayikra isn't written normally, that the word is spelled normally, but the size is a little bit funny. Vayikra Hashem el Moshe, Vayedaber Hashem elav me'ol moed lemor. Okay, so it would be good now if I could. Okay, all right. So the question is Vayikra. Okay, that's a fairly normal thing to have Hashem calling out to a person. But why is it that in this week's parsha, the aleph in the Vayikra is extra small? So I can show, I'm turning the thing for a second. You can see. It's like a little itty bitty aleph. Significantly smaller than, I didn't share my screen. Sorry, everybody. That's okay. You forgive me? Hope you forgive me. I can't figure out how to share my screen. My computer's acting funny. Okay, so the small aleph. So there is, literally, if you look on the side here, the number of, there are 230 commentaries on Sefaria on this one pasuk. It is, for whatever reason, I guess, whenever there is a change in the actual text of the Torah, it's such an unusual thing that everybody has what to say. Everybody has a comment. So one of the more famous things that is said about this is that, and this is discussed by the Baal HaTurim, I think quotes this medrash, that Hashem, when he was dictating the Torah to Moshe, said to him, now write, Vayikra Hashem el Moshe. And Moshe said, I can't say that. And Hashem, no, Vayikra Hashem el Moshe. And Moshe felt, no, because if I write that you called me by name, that puts me in an elevated position. Everybody's going to know, as though we don't already, but everyone's going to know that you called me differently than you called any other Navi. And in particular, he may be referring to the Vayikar, which is talked about with Bilam, right? Who was sort of Moshe's the 180-degree version of Moshe, meaning he had a very high level of prophecy, but he used it for evil. The language with Bilam is Vayikar. The aleph is missing. And that gives us the language of Mikre, happenstance, Hashem chanced upon Bilam. He was a guy, but he wasn't, wasn't such an elevated guy. Just happened to be that he picked him out of a hat as the prophet that was going to be the main character in that story. It's also obviously that language is very much related to Amalek, which is, good Purim Torah, that the language of Mikre and Vayikar is the language that's always associated with Amalek, both in the Torah and in Megillas Esther. And that has to do with both the fact that they believe that everything is chance, everything is Mikre, it just is. It's not premeditated. It's not part of a plan. There is no God. In general, for all of the, I think, emotional difficulty that we have understanding that there's a group of people that we were commanded that we have to wipe out, men, women, children, babies, puppies, the whole thing, which is a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around. I think something that gives it a little bit of perspective is Amalek was never waging a war against the Jews. Amalek was waging a war against God. And that already we can't tolerate, right? So even though for myself, I might say okay, I know I'm supposed to get rid of you guys, but I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to be a little bit compassionate or merciful because maybe we can rehabilitate you. Maybe you guys could get better. Yeah, but their problem was never with us in the first place. The problem was they were fighting against the notion that there is a God, that there is a creator who has a plan and is masterful and knows all and sees all. And so when that's the situation, then there really isn't room for that in the world. It's not a personal problem. It's not an interpersonal issue. It's a God issue. So that language is used very often for people who challenge Hashem, the language of Mikra. So Moshe is saying, I can't put Vayikra, because then by definition, everyone's going to be like, sure, Bilam was Vayikar, but Moshe is Vayikra. And it made Moshe uncomfortable that he would be, it's not that he was afraid to acknowledge his role, but he was afraid to make it seem like he was, lauding it over people. Like, I'm Moshe, Hashem called out to me and everybody knows I wrote the Torah. It's awkward. I can't do it. But what are you going to do? God's telling him to write it. So according to the Medrash, he makes it a small aleph. And that is like, one of the many, many, many stories that the sages tell us that proves to us Moshe's humility and how he really had succeeded in nullifying his own ego in the process of being appointed the leader of the Jewish people. So that's one beautiful interpretation. The other interpretation that I heard in a shir from Rabbi Yisrael Kamenetsky, who was a principal in New York and very beloved mechanech, he gives a shir, it must be on Chasam Sofer, because I see on YU Torah, he has like a lot of them. So I had the opportunity to listen to one, and he is a pleasure to listen to. And he quoted a beautiful, beautiful midrash that I think gave me new insight to this word Vayikra. That's really very special and something that I think is very practical in our everyday life. So he quotes the midrash that says, and this is also a quote from the prayer Uva L'Tzion, which we say every day. We say, V'kara ze el ze v'yamar, right? The angels, they call out to each other, one to another. Umekablin den min den ve'amrin, okay? And then they say, kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. So what does that mean? So it's actually V'kara ze el ze v'yamar is Hebrew, and umekablin din min din is the Aramaic translation. Our understanding is that angels don't speak Hebrew, angels speak no, it's the opposite. Angels speak Hebrew and they don't understand Aramaic. And so there's always, whenever angels are involved, we usually, like in Kedusha, we usually have things in both Hebrew and Aramaic. And what's fascinating is that translation, if you pay attention, V'kara ze el ze umekablin dein min dein. Like, since when does calling have to do with umekablin, receiving? That's such an interesting translation. I would have thought, like, I don't know, the translation of likro, to call somebody, is like ledaber, right? Or something having to do with speaking, telling. But what the Medrash is telling us is that there is an acquisition that happens. There's a receiving that happens when the malachim call each other. And specifically, the Medrash says that what happens up there is that one greater angel, which either means that he's older or more experienced, or I don't know what that means, because I don't know what the grading system is, but one greater malach would call out to a less great malach and would say, come on, let's go, let's do it together. And then together they would call out, kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. So you have this image that the Medrash is giving us, that they're calling out to each other, which is like a nice thing, like, come on, let's go, let's putting their arms around each other, let's do this together. But it's giving us an additional insight that it's not just about like being inclusive. It's that there's a Kabbalah that's happening. There is a reception that by one angel calling out to the other, they are giving to each other in a way that it can be received by the other. They're giving each other strength. They're giving each other power to be able to fulfill their mission. And the Medrash itself says it's nosaf lo koach lekadesh et Hashem. Like it gives them this additional power, this additional strength to be able to call out to Hashem. And that is the Medrash, and what the Chasam Sofer says, that's how you need to read the word Vayikra. When Hashem calls out to Moshe, what he's saying to him is, Moshe, like, you're my guy. We could do this together. You have my full support. I want you to be in this with me. And the Chasam Sofer says, and that's the only reason why Moshe was able to do what he was able to do in the first place. He was, after all, a human being. Okay, he was the closest human being that ever achieved a status of almost being an angel, living without food and all of that. Okay, so he wasn't your typical human being, but nevertheless, he was a person. The only thing that allowed him, and Moshe was very clear on this, and this is kind of like validating for Moshe, that he didn't want people to think he was so special. He wanted them to know he was only special because Hashem made it so. And so he never shied away from he shied away in the beginning from taking leadership, but once he accepted it, he continued, and he was a strong, very strong leader, strong advocate for the Jewish people. But he was fully aware that the reason why he was in the position he was in was because Hashem granted it to him, not because he had done something that earned him this place. And that's what we could understand is being conveyed by this language of Vayikra, that Hashem was the one who was nosaf koach, in the same way that the angels give each other strength. So Hashem is giving Moshe the strength to build that relationship that allowed him to be able to be his, B'chol beiti ne'emanhu, and he is my greatest servant. He was Eved Ne'eman, the most trusted servant, the most trusted partner that Hashem ever had. With that being said, so it's interesting just to, I think, note sometimes the psychological insights that the Mefarshim and Chazal give us, which is in this particular case, here we see the lesson is being, taught to us through Hashem. It's being taught to us through the angels. It's being taught to us through Moshe. But on a practical level for ourselves, what I think this is saying is, when you call out to someone, Vayikra, and there's a lot of discussion, Rav Pinkus talks about this in his Sefer Sha'arim B'Tefillah, the idea of Vayikra. Like he explains, Rav Pinkus, based on the Gemara, that every time you see the language of Vayikra from a person, it's Tefillah, that the person is engaged in tefillah. So even if you don't see the word, and you often don't see the word vayitpalel, you often see other words, right? You see vayipol, sometimes the person fell on their face, you see other words. If you see the language of vayikra, know that that person was davening. And in particular, that the notion of vayikra is always b'shem. It's always with the person's name. It's not just a stam calling out, it's the acknowledgement, it's the recognition that I'm addressing what I'm about to say to someone. And it's as though, I remember in Rav Pinkus' Sefer, he gives an example of like, you're in one room and, your friend is in a different room in the house, and the person's in the house with you, like you saw them a few minutes ago. So they're there, and you call out to them. You can't see them and you can't hear them, but you know that they're there. So you call out their name, and you call out their name, and you just wait because you know that they're listening, but you just wait for them to acknowledge you. He says that's what tefillah is, that a person, when they call out to Hashem, they should have in mind, like, I know he's there. Okay, it would be nice if he would, give a wave or a knock on the door or something, so I know he's there. But it's that awareness that like, no, I know he's here. And that's the way that we call out. So this whole idea of calling with a name is also picked up in a very famous Rashi, that every time you see the word, every time you see Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, this pasuk teaches us that every calling out to Moshe, every speaking that Hashem does to Moshe actually starts with the same Vayikra that we have here. It's only written once here, but this is the model for every conversation Hashem ever had with Moshe. And why is this so significant? Because Rashi and the Ramban also, they want to teach us a very beautiful lesson, which is that before you give someone instructions, before you tell them what is the Lemor, before you tell them what it is, before you tell Moshe what it is he should be telling the Jewish people, you call him out by name. Moshe, I have something to tell you that I want you to tell the Jewish people, that there's a derech, it's called derech lashon chiba, derech chiba. It's done in a way to create a more beloved connection, a sense of closeness, lechabev, to bring a person closer and to embrace them. It's the language of embrace. And I think this is something, and we all know this because we've either received it or we've been the ones who have said this. Very often, we only say people's full names when we are annoyed at them, right? Like the stereotype is that we only say all of our children's names in Hebrew, English, and whatever other names they might have when they're in trouble. Like we don't ever call them by all their names to hug them and kiss them and tell them what a great job they did. Generally, all the names come out when we're frustrated. And what the Torah is telling us is when you use a person's name, it creates a connection. It creates something very, very significant. It creates a sense of love and a sense of endearment. And Hashem wanted that type of relationship with Moshe, and they clearly had it. But what this means for us is that when we are not just giving instructions to somebody, and the Torah is telling you, don't ever just give instructions to somebody, like call their name first. Don't just say, can you? Just say like, Shira, would you please eat all the hamantashen, instead of just saying, eat all the hamantashen, that creates just saying a person's name builds connection and builds relationship. And the Torah models that for us. And I think that is a very practical tip as to how to build connection with another person. You see it sometimes like in texts or emails, when a person starts the text or the email with your name first, like, hi, and then they say, hi, Shira, hi, Rifki. There's something you're like, oh, it feels like it's closer than just a quick, what time are we meeting today? And it's normal that for most of us, we don't think to do it and we don't have the time, but it's good to acknowledge that when we do take the time, it makes a difference. It's a small thing, but it actually makes a difference. And this idea in general of having an introduction is something that Rabbi Kamenetsky spoke about, which I never thought of it. It's just something that we say like hopefully a couple times a day. I never thought about it from this perspective, but I think it's beautiful. So he explains that it's not just the element of connection and creating closeness, which it is, but it's also, according to the Ramban, it's also a reshus. It's also, he's being given permission. And where do we see this is because according to the Medrash, it's at this point that Hashem gives Moshe permission to enter the Mishkan without knocking first, without requesting permission to enter. He gave him like carte blanche. From now on, whenever you want to walk in, this is your place, Moshe. You can come in. Like he basically is giving him the keys to the Mishkan. You don't have to knock first, which by the way, teaches us that in general, you're not supposed to go into a place without knocking first. That is in general, it's appropriate, polite behavior. And this is true whether it's in your own house and the door is closed, or you're coming into the house from the outside. We learned this lesson from the Kohen Gadol also, that he was always the pamonim and rimonim at the bottom of his me'il, the bells and the pomegranates. He made noise. And the Medrash tells us, like, that's a weird thing. No, he needed that because he was going into the holiest places, and you can't just walk into Hashem's house and not knock first. Okay, so there's no place to knock. So he made noise. So it was like coming in. We joke about a family member of mine who packs his pockets with lots of things, and you can hear him coming from 2 miles away. So we always say, he's like, oh, here comes the Kohen Gadol, because we hear it's like the feet make a certain sound and the pills rustling and there's just like a lot going on. And we always say like, oh, it's because he doesn't want to have to knock. We all know he's coming. It's okay. So in general, that's a practical, nice thing to remind ourselves of, that it's good just to announce yourself before you go somewhere and ask for permission. But Rabbi Kamenetsky points out, so Hashem's giving Moshe permission to come into the Mishkan, which is huge because it had been that it was filled with the cloud. He couldn't even get in. He couldn't get in, and he understood that meant he needed special permission. So he waited. And then Vayikra el Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem elav. When Hashem calls Moshe now, this is him giving the keys to Moshe to the Mishkan, which is funny because really it's Aaron's place. Like it's Aaron's place of work. Aaron's going to be the one who is going to be involved in all the karbanos and everything. But the Ol Moed, the place where Hashem communicates with Moshe, is here also. So I guess they had to share an office, so to speak. So Rabbi Kamenetsky points out it's a combination, really, this language of both endearment and permission. And he said this is a great way of understanding why we begin Shmona Esrei the way we begin Shmona Esrei. Because if you ever stop to think about it, and you probably have at some point, we say the pasuk from Tehillim, Hashem sfatai tiftach, Hashem, please open my lips, ufi yagid tehilatacha, and let my mouth sing your praises, and let it say over, share your praises. And that always just felt like a pasuk that helps us just like, focus. It's like a meditation pasuk. Like I'll just be, perfectly honest. By the time you're done with like Shema and all the brachos that lead you up there, like maybe you got a little distracted and maybe you weren't paying attention so much. Maybe you got lost in the words, but now I'm starting Shemona Esrei. Like I got to refocus myself and make sure that I'm standing in front of the King of Kings. Like I want to make sure that I'm focused. So Rabbi Kamenetsky explained that it's not so much a focus as it is a request for permission. That in the same, and he included the same way that we take the 3 steps back, which is sort of like, it's almost like I'm retreating for a moment and then I'm asking for permission to come into this very intimate meeting with Hashem. And that pasuk is a great way of sort of framing that idea. Hashem, I'm asking for permission to be able to talk to you, because it's not a natural thing that we should have an audience with Hashem 3 times a day. We should be able to speak to him face to face. Okay, he sees our face, we don't see his face, but like that's not something that we should just like barge into. You've got to retreat first and then ask for permission. Hashem, is it okay for my lips and my mouth to try and praise you and try and, engage in conversation with you, which is just really a beautiful idea. It's a kind of a kriya. It's a kind of vayikra of calling out. And he mentions also an idea that I think is relevant. And with this, we'll wrap up. The idea that Moshe very clearly heard the call of Hashem, right? Moshe was Hashem focused. We know by this point in his life already, he most likely already separated from his wife. We don't hear about his children. He was not involved in his family. He was completely and totally invested in his relationship with Hashem and being, an agent on behalf of the Jewish people and being their leader. So he was totally keyed in. When Hashem called him, he heard him. And the Torah records it really just this once to let us know that this is what went on all the time. Whenever Hashem called Moshe, he always engaged him by name and then gave him his instructions. Beautiful. It's a great thing that we should try to keep in mind, to use people's names and introduce ideas before we start barking orders at people. If anybody could bark orders, it was Hashem, and Moshe would have listened, but he didn't. So obviously we should try to avoid it as well. But the idea that there is a kriya happening all the time is something that Rabbi Kamenetsky mentioned based on the Chasam Sofer, that in general, we all, I shouldn't say we, I will say, well, if only Hashem would just tell me exactly what it is that he wants, then, or if he would just talk to me a little bit more clearly, then like he did with the Jews in the desert, or like he did with Moshe or Avram or somebody, okay, then you can have expectations that I'll know what you want. And I hope I would try to do the right thing. But now things are confusing and we don't really know. So he quoted Rabbi J.J. Schachter, one of my all-time favorite teachers, who says that it's best to assume that Hashem is always calling us. It's always there. We might not have dialed in the right frequency. If you remember, when we had to do that on radios and stuff, right? We might not have adjusted whatever reception that we need to be able to hear it. He said, but in general, he feels like over the last 2 years, we all were walking around knowing that Hashem was calling us. More than we have in a very long time. Maybe we felt this as individuals when things would go on in our lives. We knew Hashem was trying to tell us something. But it's hard to remember a time where the entire world was in this heightened state of alert. And we knew that someone, the universe, was trying to tell us something. And what Rabbi Schachter pointed out was the problem is, as wonderful as it is that we all were so aware that Hashem was no one had any idea what he was trying to tell us. This has been one of the more confusing times in history, where it's not that there's anything explicable about the war happening right now in Russia and Ukraine, but you see that there are people doing bad things, and that's what's creating the violence and the war. And there's a way to understand it from a human perspective. When you look at something like a pandemic, how can you explain that? How can you, it's got to be a message from Hashem. It's something none of us could even see with the naked eye. It has to be that he was trying to tell us something. And he said, that's really al derech drush, just by way of homiletics, that's the little aleph. The little aleph is we know we're being called and we don't know what we're being called for. And that's a complicated, to give us a little bit of space, and we don't have to feel bad that we didn't get it. We don't know what Hashem is trying to tell us. And in general, that causes a lot of confusion, a lot of difficulty. So that it's good to be tuned in to the calls, and that the best that we can do is continue to call out to Hashem in reverse and say, quoting the Yishai Ribo song, right? What do you want us to understand from this, right? How are we supposed to serve you with all this going on, to sort of turn around that vayikra and recognize when we're being called and we don't understand what Hashem is trying to say to us? It's the time to continue to call out to Hashem until it becomes more clear. So those are just a couple of ideas, mostly on the word of vayikra, but also on this first pasuk in this week's parsha. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody.
Rifki?
Yes.
Yes, it's Jewel. A strategy that radio announcers use when it's a call-in show, and they want to get the person to stop talking, they call his name. And so when you'll notice this if you listen, he calls his name and then the person stops. So there's something in calling a name, for good and for bad.
Yeah. No, the truth is that it's a great way to get a person's attention. So that makes sense. But what you want it to be is that it's not always in a negative context, right? We want it to be that people don't, and I've heard this from people, that they associate their full name with being in trouble. And that's right. A name is supposed to be the spiritual essence of a human being. We're not supposed to associate it with something negative. But for many of us, to hear first, middle, and last name, like I got a stomach ache. I think, I think I'm getting called to the principal's office. Not that that was my actual lived experience, but just maybe where they would call me like, Rebecca Tova Geltman, Rivka Tova, like the whole thing. So it's good to not just use names when people are in trouble, but also when we're trying to build a positive connection as well.